Now we're going to have Christopher Holme, and he's from the city planner at the Department of City Planning. He will discuss the zoning text amendment moving through the approval process, the ULURP, to give homeowners some flexibility to meet FEMA flood requirements. And then he will be followed with David Nussbaum, External Affairs at the Department of Building, and he will address building codes, and is joined by two Department of Engineers that are here. So, Christopher. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Just let me know if I'm not speaking loud enough for you. I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're working on here. First of all, it's about zoning. Zoning regulates the use of land and buildings, how they're used, commercial or residential, and the location of the building on the lot and its relationship to the street, how high it can be, and so on. So the project I'm working on, this zoning resilience text amendment, the goal is to make sure that there isn't a scenario where somebody has a property that's substantially damaged and they're required to elevate that building, needs to be repaired in a flood resilient way. And let's say the building is, maybe it was built in 1940, it's taller than would be allowed today by zoning, and they need to elevate the building. Zoning today doesn't allow that. You can't take a building that's already too tall and make it taller. So what this proposal does is it allows that sort of thing to happen, especially for single and two-family homes. That can happen in every case. You can always take the building and elevate the lowest floor to the extent necessary to make it comply with building code and FEMA's flood-resistant construction standards, so that we can keep those buildings in our neighborhoods. And it also allows new buildings to do the same thing, to build to a more flood-resilient standard, and it provides the zoning relief necessary to have that done. So I'll just go through it briefly. In January, after the storm, the mayor issued an executive order, and that executive order overrides these kind of zoning issues that would be a problem to allow buildings to rebuild in a more resilient fashion. And that's voluntary. Basically, if you're not substantially damaged, but you want to rebuild in a more flood resilient manner, you can use the executive order to do that. And after our text amendment has been approved, you can use this zoning text to do the same thing, and the executive order will be allowed to expire. The executive order is an emergency executive order. I think I mentioned that it came into effect in January, and it has to be renewed every 5 days. So this zoning text will replace that, and it does a lot more than that, because the executive order just sets aside rules in order to let things happen. It wasn't, state law doesn't allow it to create new rules. So the zoning text sets up some additional rules that does things that the executive order couldn't do. Then obviously it's all about more flood resilient buildings, and also addressing the insurance issue. Even if you want more than 50% damage, property owner wants to rebuild in a more flood resilient way to avoid higher flood insurance premiums. This is something that we're trying to get zoning out of the way to make that happen. It applies only within the 100-year flood zone. The 100-year flood zone is a lot larger, as Dan was just talking about, and I guess I'll go on from there. I want to point out a couple of things. The executive order came into effect in January basically at the same time that the Department of Buildings changed the building code and brought New York City building code into alignment with state building code, which says that when you build, you have to build to either a foot or 2 feet higher than what's on the flood maps. That extra foot or two is called freeboard. That's changing, and then of course we've got the flood maps that have changed significantly, as Dan was talking about. So zoning basically responds to those changing regulations and puts it all in a package where people can use the latest information from FEMA and add this extra foot or two of freeboard that's now required on top of that, and have a more flood resilient building. This is just a map of the Red Hook area here, and if you want to take a look at that map in more detail, we have some paper maps in the back here, a couple of them you could take home. We've got a big poster as well. If you're within the 100-year flood zone, the new 100-year flood zone, which hasn't been adopted yet, these rules will still allow you to use this geography, even though it hasn't been adopted yet. FEMA expects that it'll be adopted by around 2015. Okay, so this is just saying that in order to use these optional regulations, you need to build to a flood resilient standard using building code and building to the new flood maps, which are a little bit higher elevation, plus the freeboard. And you apply that to all the building code requirements. And this slide basically lays out what the rules already are in building code, and these rules are in building code. They are aligned with FEMA's standards. And so in order for New York City to participate in the flood insurance program, FEMA requires that building code has to reflect certain standards. So on the left here, for residential buildings, this is basically summarizing what FEMA's requirements are. All the living space has to be elevated above the flood level, and any space below that has to be wet flood proof, so that if it gets wet, there won't be any substantial damage. So we're talking about materials like concrete and tile and things like that. FEMA also doesn't allow residential buildings to have cellars in the flood zone. So if you're building new, you wouldn't be allowed to have a cellar. If you're retrofitting, if you're more than substantially damaged and you want to bring your building into compliance, you have to fill in that cellar. And on the right, if you've got a mixed building with some kind of commercial use on the ground floor, or a building that's all commercial, or any other kind of non-residential, then you have the option of, again, either elevating that use, and whatever is below is just parking, storage, or building access, or you can have the option of what's called dry flood proofing, keeping that ground use, that floor at ground level, keeping it as an active use, and putting in flood panels in order to keep the water out. So this is just sort of summarizing what these rules are, what they have been for some time. But in order to, understand and adapt to what the rules are and apply these rules to our situation, this is the kind of stuff we have to look at. So just in order to summarize the text amendment, there's just basically 6 main categories shown here. The first is that in order for people to have the same amount of space in their building, if they're retrofitting or building new, the height of the building needs to be measured not from, zoning typically measures from the ground or from curb level. Instead of measuring from ground or curb level in flood zones, height will be measured from this flood level, the freeboard plus the latest flood maps. And that allows buildings to have the same amount of usable space. Then in terms of access, if buildings are elevated up, it could be several feet above grade, there's going to be longer ramps and stairs, and there's some zoning changes we needed to make in order to accommodate that. Mechanical systems, I'm sure you're all aware of the advantages of moving mechanical systems. It's sort of low-hanging fruit. They're very vulnerable, and in terms of bang for your buck, anyway, it's something that we really want to encourage. So there are a lot of zoning options now with our proposal to relocate those mechanical systems either to the roof, inside the building or in a rear yard. So we want to really help get those systems out of harm's way. Again, with cellars, if there's an existing building that needs to be retrofitted, either maybe it's substantially damaged, and the only way to comply with building code is to fill in the cellar. A lot of these cellars have parking spaces in them, and so our zoning provides relief in order to keep parking on the site. And if there's no way, even with these zoning, with this zoning relief, if there's no way to keep the parking on the site, it allows the buildings commissioner to waive the parking. And then there's the ground floor of buildings that are either too big to be elevated, it's an apartment building, or it's attached. That describes a lot of buildings in Red Hook. The zoning that we're proposing will allow a property owner to wet floodproof the ground floor and use it only for parking, storage, and building access. That's complying with FEMA standards and with building code. If the property owner does that, they will be able to relocate that same amount of floor space elsewhere on the zoning lot, as long as it fits within the height limits and the yard requirements and so on. So that provides a pathway to flood resilience in a way that's recognized by FEMA. And then finally, in terms of the streetscape, with all these buildings gradually over time elevating, as you go down the block, there'll be more buildings with the first floor higher, and in anticipation of the way that could affect the streetscape, the zoning proposal builds in some streetscape mitigation requirements. So if a building is being elevated more than 5 feet, there will be some planting required or other visual mitigation required at the time that that happens. So I'm ready for any questions.
When was this amendment actually released, the new zoning text amendment? Oh, yes.
Thank you. This was released the end of May, and the City Planning Commission held a public hearing last week, August 7th, and we expect the City Planning Commission to vote on this early September, and then it goes to City Council, and we hope that they'll be voting on that in October. They have 50 days to review the proposal after the City Planning Commission vote. So it should be in effect sometime in October, hopefully.
And then this might be a question more for the Department of Buildings representative, and then why did the Department of Buildings reps that we met with not advise us about this rule when they told us we were going to have to build our houses instead of leaving us in this desperate situation where we had to lose 1 or 2 floors of our buildings and there's not going to be any extra FAR. And now we see this in writing. We said it was in effect in May, and I had this meeting 2 weeks ago. So is this just not uninformed employees, or was this some kind of speaking to the letter of the law and not the...
Well, I guess, yeah. I mean, we did a training with the Department of Buildings when this was released, but I guess, we can talk about that again, more later if you're interested. Yes.
Can you just elaborate on what you mean by wet flood proofing, especially of thatched homes where it's possibility that elevation does not exist as
Okay. Wet flood proofing is basically treating a home with materials that won't get damaged if they get inundated by floodwater. So talking about tiles or concrete, materials like that. I'm not really an expert when it comes to the nitty-gritty of building code. I just sort of know the overview, and again, maybe people here from Department of Buildings can give you specific details. It's all laid out in Appendix G of the building code, so we can go further into nitty-gritty and just look at the regs. How about over here? Yes. Okay, well, let's just make sure we're on the same page. So this is in order to comply with FEMA's flood-resistant construction standards. It's optional if you're not substantially damaged, but if somebody wants to go that route, right. Right, exactly, right. If you've got more than 2 stories, then it's very unlikely that you'd be substantially damaged. So it's optional, but if you want to go that route, then in order to comply, you can't have and if it's an all residential building, you can't have a cellar, and if you're not elevating, the whole story that is, or at least up to where the flood level is on that story has to be wet flood proofed, as we were just talking about. Does that answer your question? Well, the idea, what I was just talking about there, allows a garden apartment that is more than half above ground to be, if that's wet flood proofed, and you can fit that within the height limits and everything, that's precisely what the zoning text is allowing you to do. The height limits are measured from the new flood level plus the freeboard. So it's measured from higher up. The upper left corner, the idea is that we're measuring from the new flood levels for height. Yes. Yes. If you comply with flood-resistant construction standards and building code, then that will absolutely relate directly to the flood insurance. I mean, you should obviously double check with flood insurance, but that's my understanding. That Appendix G in building code, those rules line up with flood insurance standards. So,
I'm Aline. I'm the planner for this district. So some of these regulations will allow you to make changes that are not, like moving your electrical systems. That's not going to trigger all of the regulations. So you could do that, and you won't have to raise your whole house. That would be allowed. Right. Now this may not, right, but it may not affect your flood insurance rates. So, we're trying to make, this is trying to make it as feasible as possible for people to do what they want to do in the way that they want to do it, I guess.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to illustrate in the upper left corner. All height measurements will be from the new flood level instead of from the old flood level or from grade. Yeah.